Well, good morning again. It's good to be with you. I enjoyed teaching the Bible class. If you want those slides, I'll be glad to send them to you. Just let Warren or Sam know, and they've got my email. You can contact me. I'll be glad to send the PowerPoint to you so that you can use them. I can only go so many places. If they're useful to you, please use them to strengthen people's faith. And so thank you for the weekend. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. To Warren and Sam, that you go into all the work that has to go with this kind of thing. I thank you. And to the elders, thank you. My wife Wilna is with us this morning. Of course, y'all have Jonathan, and so thank you for taking care of him and keeping him on his toes and doing what he needs to do. Thad is a longtime friend of our family, Thad Clevenger. I've known him probably almost as long as he's been alive, maybe about 5 or 6 years old. I preached at the first place his parents were in Longview, Texas at that time, so we got really close to that family. My wife's name is Wilna with an N and not an M. I tell people I'm not Fred and she's not Wilma. So only people that know the Flintstones even get that anymore. But anyway, I'm glad that she's able to be with me. But again, thank you. Appreciate so much the nice comments, to be with young people and to work with them. I want to talk this morning, in this morning lesson, about why I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. John 20, verses 1 through 9 was read in your hearing. Jesus claimed that he would rise from the dead. In Matthew 17, verse 9, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one of this vision until the Son of Man be raised from the dead." Mark 9, verse 33, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise." Luke 24, verse 46, "Thus it is written that the Christ should suffer, and on the third day rise from the dead." Over and over again, Jesus told his disciples that this is what would happen. And so when the apostles preached the resurrection of Jesus, we shouldn't be surprised to read it again and again in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 3, verse 15, "You killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses." In chapter 4 and verse 2, "Greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead." In chapter 10, beginning at verse 40, "But God raised him on the third day and made him to appear to us who had been chosen by God as witness, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead." When Paul preached to the Gentiles, Festus's reaction as a procreator, a Roman who believed in the gods of the Romans and the Greeks, as he preached about Jesus, he said that Christ must suffer, and being the first to rise from the dead, they would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. And at that saying, Festus said with a loud voice, "Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind." The reaction in Athens, Greece was no different. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Others said, "We'll hear you again about this." Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:23, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles." Years ago when I preached in Louisville, Kentucky, there was a girl that came to be a part of that congregation because her husband worked for Boeing aircraft. Boeing at that time made, I don't know if they still do, all of the aircraft that China, the communist nation, uses in their civilian air industry. And so he had been over there numerous times, had met his wife there. Her family were mid-party members of the Communist Party in China. So they weren't the high-ups, they weren't the lows, but they lived a very comfortable life compared to what communism was back in China was back in the early 90s. This girl was fascinated. She came over because they were expediting her U.S. citizenship. So she came to live with her brother and sister, or sister-in-law and brother-in-law. And she was the sister of the brother that was her husband. And so she got interested. And I began to study the Bible with her. I was young. It was new. I grew up in a little tiny town where everybody went to church. I mean, if I was going to open the Bible with somebody, I would open the Bible and say, let's turn over to a passage. And we'd read what he said about baptism, and then we'd argue about it because they went to the Baptist church or they went to the Methodist church. Wherever they were, we agreed that this Bible was the Word of God. I didn't have to begin where we began a few moments ago in the Bible class. So I was brand new at all this. I was beginning to realize I needed, our world was shifting. And this international connection that I had made taught me a lesson that it took a while to learn. And that is, I don't live in that world anymore. I don't live in a world where Christians are next door to me. You sure don't live in that world today. Where people go to church, everybody on the block. You may live next door to a Buddhist, or you may live next door to a Hindu. One time our house sold to people that were Buddhist, and they came in and burned incense to, as I say, excise my wife's Aggie spirit. She's a A&M Aggie. Sorry, Thad. But anyway, people around the corner from us celebrated Ramadan, decorated their yard in green and yellow and lights and all of that when they celebrate that. We don't live in that world anymore. We live in this world that, as you well know in Bentonville, is housed with thousands of Hindus, those who are Buddhists, those who don't care at all about the Scriptures, people that we want to try to reach. How do we reach them? I remember talking to her, and I wasn't getting through, till finally I just decided I've got to do what they did in the book of Acts. So I began to proclaim to her the resurrection. I mean, we're going to get there, but I wasn't thinking about that. We were talking about other stuff. And I started telling her about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when she got the fact that I believed with all of my heart and soul and mind that a man went in the tomb and came out of the tomb on the third day, alive, I remember how astonished she was. She had only heard about Jesus. I want you to imagine somebody who only knew the name Jesus, but had no idea about his story. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know if she ever came to faith. She didn't while I was there, but I was doing the best I knew how to try to teach her. That's where we are. The one thing you have to be convinced of is not only that the Word of God is the truth, but that the resurrection of Jesus Christ happened in fact. Folks, if that's not true, then as Paul said, we might as well, in Corinthian letter, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Jesus came back from the tomb on the third day. Why should I believe in the resurrection? That account that was read to you in John 20. Well, first of all, we need to address the matter, did Jesus really die? Because there are a lot of people come up with theories. You know that the Quran, the Islamic people, believe that Jesus is a prophet. I don't know if you didn't know that. Now you know it. He's not the prophet to them. He's not the greatest prophet that Muhammad is. But they still believe that he is a prophet. And what they say about him, the Quran says that he wasn't killed. Most Muslims believe he was raised to heaven without being put on the cross, and that God created a resemblance to appear exactly like Jesus, who was crucified instead of Jesus, who had ascended bodily to heaven, there to remain until the second coming at the end of days. In the 19th century, the swoon theory was for the first time, maybe back in the 17th century there was a few people, but the 19th century really lit it afire. And that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He passed out from all of the trauma. He was put alive in the tomb, somehow revives himself, comes out of the tomb, gets by the guards, appears to the apostles, and then vanishes into history, into the thinness of oblivion. Well, we'll think about those things together. Let's just look at what the Bible tells us, the facts that they put forth to us. You're the jury. This morning you're listening to the evidence. You're listening to people that wrote as eyewitnesses. And I want you to understand how important witnesses are. Have any of you ever served on a jury? Raise your hand, please. Yeah, lots of you have. I've served on a jury. They finally let me on a jury. The most time they don't let preachers on juries. We're biased against in that world both ways, and for reasons that they have. But I not only got on the jury, they elected me to be foreman of the jury. And it was a fascinating process. I've always been intrigued by the fact that they're not kings, they're not people that stand up. Yeah, there's corruption in our society, but I'm going to tell you one of the places that you know still it works pretty well is that there are a group of men and women who are your peers, who are listening to the facts of the case being argued on both sides, trying to present their best, trying to demonize the other side. But out of that antagonism, you're to see the truth. You're to get to the core of what really happened and make your decision based on that. And I saw that work out, living before my eyes, trying to convince people. 9 of us were voting in favor of condemning this guy, and we had 2 holdouts. And that idea of having to give them evidence and go back to the testimony and references was living and breathing before me. That's exactly what's going on here. We have witnesses telling us we touched him, we saw him, we heard him after he was resurrected. And to know how powerful that is, eyewitness testimony. So what does the Bible tell us about his death? He was scourged. In a minute I'll show you some pictures that come out of the Journal of the American Medical Association, an article that was written back in March 1986. But let's just describe it now. Scourging was so terrible that Roman citizens were never punished by this means. In Acts 16, verse 37, Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens." Not everybody was a Roman citizen. If you were a Roman citizen, that was special. And when that was reported to the leaders, the magistrates, they were afraid when they heard they were Roman citizens. They could lose their life, and I mean fast, because they had dared to beat a Roman citizen. Eusebius describes to us in the 3rd century, the scourging of the sufferer, his veins were laid bare, the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. Many victims died in the scourgings when they were crucified. Jesus would have bled profusely. I want you to understand, what was left of his back were slivers of flesh, blood going everywhere. And he was put in the tomb with that back. We need to remember what happened. The crucifixion, John 19 and verse 18 that was read or later in that chapter. Roman citizens could not be executed by crucifixion because it was so degrading and horrible of a death. Cicero says to us, the great Roman orator, that it is the most cruel and disgusting punishment, and said the very mention of the cross should be far removed not only from a Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his heart, and his eyes. You remember that the account tells us in John 19, verse 33, that the Passover was nearing, and so those bodies had to be taken down from the cross. And all of that had to be done before Passover began. And so the Roman soldiers came by, and we know of these stories with great hammers, big hammers. And they would come up to the legs of the sufferer and smash them into bits, into pieces. And there will be a reason we describe in a minute. But the point of it was to hasten death. When they came to Jesus, the account says to us in John 19:34, again, remember, John is there. He is an eyewitness. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. If somehow Jesus was still alive, that spear being thrust through his lungs and into his heart would have made sure that he was dead. What happened when blood and water came out is consistent with the modern medical evidence that we know. Hope Jonathan doesn't mind me telling this story about him, but I guess it really doesn't matter. I'm going to tell it. Our son was born very premature in life. He was born at 24 weeks. We prayed earnestly. In fact, we had a meeting with Connie Adams, and Connie said he never flew anywhere. He always drove. He said, I've been all over this country coming down to start y'all's gospel meeting. He said, that kid has been prayed for everywhere. Of course, that made my wife and I feel really good. Jonathan struggled to live. We had lots of issues, and I could go through all that, but for time's sake, it's just he had lots of issues. Later on, we just had surgeries after surgeries, and one of them was that they had to operate on his chest. They had to put a bar behind it. So they had to break the sternum away from the rib cage and push his sternum out and put that metal piece behind it to push his sternum away so that he'd have better lung capacity. And when we had that scar that was on him, every day the doctor had to go in on that scar and take out the trauma fluid that would collect around the heart and that sac. He had to take it out. I can remember holding Jonathan down. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, you know. But he was always a polite kid, and as soon as I got off of him, he said, thanks, Doc, you know, when we got off of him. But I saw firsthand that every day on that little body was massive fluid that had to be removed. That's what's being described here when the body area in that area has trauma. The handling of the body of Jesus. Forgot to put the spear up, sorry. The handling of the body of Jesus. There were several people that did. The centurion. Do you think a centurion in charge of crucifixion, Mark 15, verse 44 and 45, Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. Summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. Question, what happened to a Roman centurion who didn't make sure he carried out Rome's rule? What happened to him if he let a prisoner escape? You remember Herod examined those that had allowed Peter to escape? He commanded that they all be put to death. That's what Romans did. And that's what Herod did to his soldiers. It is exactly what have happened to the centurion. If he had let Jesus live, he would have known most of all for his own self-interest that Jesus was dead. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, the passage we just read, Joseph of Arimathea was asking Pilate. That's why Pilate was surprised and questioned the centurion. But they take the body down from the cross. If the swoon theory was true, if there was any life left in Jesus, do you think they would have known it? Have you ever been at the side of a person that died? I'm not talking you walked in later. You were there when they died. I've only had one time so far in my life that's happened. One of our deacons, when I was at College Station, passed away. He was a young guy in his 40s, but he died. I had come to visit his wife, and her sister was in the room, and I was there the moment that Dale died. I'll never forget that. To look at someone the moment before they're dead and look at the body after they're dead, if you've seen it, you know death. You know a body that has no life in it anymore. The jaw goes slack in a way that never happened when they had the spirit inside of them. And that happened. I'm going to tell you, Nicodemus and Joseph would have known if Jesus was dead or alive. And then the Jewish leaders who wanted Jesus dead more certain than anything tell Pilate, seal the tomb and post a guard. Folks, they would have stretched a rope across that stone. They would have sealed it with wax, and in the end of the wax would have been taken Pilate's signet ring, and they would have impressed it with Rome's authority. Anyone daring to break that rope or seal would suffer the full wrath of the Romans. They would have died if Pilate didn't order the tomb to be opened. And so they further confirm that the body was placed inside and Jesus was dead. What about the tomb? Well, before we get to the tomb, I promised to show you pictures. I blocked out part of this picture because, generally speaking, the Romans stripped their victim totally naked. On either side of him were lictors. There would have been two of them. The one picture is showing you to look down on the man. If you can see to the right, you're looking like from the top. You're seeing what would happen as each man hit him with what's called the flagellum, this short whip that had finger-like leather thongs coming out from it. And along those thongs, it shows you there were pieces of jagged bone, metal balls. Can you imagine the first time the first one hit you with that and drug it back? As soon as he finished, the second one on the other side hit you and drug it back. And they did it repeatedly and repeatedly. The closest I've ever come to probably ever envisioning that was when Mel Gibson, years ago, showed what scourging might have looked like. It would have been a bloody, bloody mess and trauma beyond anything we can imagine to the body. Many died there. Jesus didn't. In fact, Jesus walked, carrying his patibulum, the top part of the cross, until he couldn't. And you remember they compelled Simon Cyrene to carry it. In that Journal of the American Medical Association back in 1986, 3 doctors that wrote it talked about where these things would have happened, where the nail would have been driven, most likely to hold the hand. One picture of where the nail could be driven in the feet, and it shows you a Roman nail about 5 to 7 inches long. We have a guy in our congregation that does exquisite metal work. He tells me sometimes, I say, "Who are you working for this week?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you their name, but they love chickens." And he'll say something like that. But he makes these nails. And he's yet to make mine. I'm going to be after him to do so because it would have been nice to have it this morning. But that's what was driven into him. Here's something that was discovered. That picture by itself on the right is an actual ankle bone of a man named Johanan, which would be John, basically. His ossuary box was found. The Jewish way of burial was to take the body into a tomb and let it decompose, totally decompose, until it was nothing but bones. At a much later date, the family would enter the tomb. They would take the bones and place them into a box called an ossuary box. And they would carry that box back further in the tomb and where it would be housed on shelves along with others of your family who had died before you. Caiaphas' tomb, by the way, has been discovered. And family, one of his sons' ossuary box has been found. They think they have found the brother of Jesus, James's ossuary box, and it's written on it. So far, there's a great debate about it, but it seems to be. But there's no mistaking this one. It's from the 1st century, an ossuary box of an ankle bone that has the Roman spike still through it. That curl on the end, caught in the wood, they couldn't take the nail out of the ankle bone, so they ripped the entire thing off when they put him into the box. The left side shows you the way it is nailed. And it is a grisly reminder of the physical evidence of what the Romans did. This happened to Jesus. And then when we think about how he would breathe, the JAMA article says the opposite of what you would think. To inhale, you would let your weight down on the cross. To exhale, you had to pull yourself up. Now the reason for smashing the bones. If you smash the bones, it's going to hasten death, because while you were able to push yourself up before as well as pull up, now all you can do is pull up. And the muscles here, far weaker than the ones in the legs, and death would come quickly. The following pictures will come to illustrate where Jesus was buried. He was buried in a rich man's tomb. Herod's family tomb has also been discovered. This is a picture of a rich person's tomb. where these giant stones would be rolled into place. Any of y'all watched The Chosen and have seen the raising of Lazarus, you saw that kind of thing, of men rolling back the stone from Lazarus' tomb. This is a physical evidence of where, much like a tomb, Jesus would have been buried in. All right? Keep all of that in mind as we go forward. When Jesus' body was placed in the tomb, some of the theories that have been put out is that his body was dumped in a common grave like other criminals. If you've seen the movie Risen, it is a story with Joseph Fiennes, who plays a Roman, high up a Roman soldier. I forgot his rank now. But he is given the command by Pilate to find the body of Jesus. And at one point in the story, they look behind where men had been crucified, and literally bodies that were corrupting, and it just was awful, flies everywhere. It shows you exactly what Romans did. There was a wall outside of Rome itself where slaves who were executed, their bodies were dumped. The stench of death remained for centuries of time, carrying birds like you can't believe. But that was a way Romans scared people, the fear that you obey us or this happens to you. So that's one of the theories. Well, his body just corrupted. He was dumped there. He was never buried, as we saw with the swoon type of theory. But none of that is plausible when you consider the evidence of the eyewitnesses, of Joseph of Arimathea who handled the body, of Rome that posted the guard at the tomb, of the centurion who would know whether someone was dead, the witnesses of the women, Mark 15:47, who saw where he was buried, it tells us, and the enemies themselves, as we've said, who said to the Roman soldiers, Matthew 28:15, they took money and did as they were directed, and the story has been spread among the Jews of this day that the apostles came and stole the body. 130 years later, they were still saying this. In 165 A.D., Justin Martyr, who was a believer, penned his dialogue with Trypho. At the beginning of chapter 108 of his work, he recorded a letter that the Jewish community had been circulating regarding the death of Jesus in the empty tomb. A godless, it said, and lawless heresy has sprung from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb, where he was laid with unfastened from the cross, and now deceives men by asserting that he has been risen from the dead and ascended into heaven. That was still being circulated 130 years later. Well, the facts. Everybody knew the tomb was empty. Nobody's going there. Can you imagine if the enemies knew where the body of Jesus was, what would they have done? They would have paraded him through Jerusalem, and it would have killed Christianity in its grave. They were greatly annoyed, Acts 4 verse 1 and 2 says, that they were teaching the people and proclaiming Jesus had been raised from the dead. The swoon theory is not even worth considering. There is nothing behind it that's more. You imagine when you've seen what we saw about what is done to you when you are scourged and crucified, that a man possibly could revive himself inside the tomb and come out. The stolen body theory, you ask who and why? The disciples? The disciples, we are told in John 20 and verse 19, were behind doors locked, where they were in fear of the Jews, the text says. And somehow we're to believe they got the courage to overcome trained Roman soldiers. Remember, guys, that we saw that picture of the Roman soldier in the animation? A Roman soldier trained to kill, a lethal weapon, and yet somehow the apostles, who wouldn't have any skills anywhere near them, are supposed to overcome them. The enemies had Jesus exactly where they wanted him. They had made sure of it. And now the tomb is empty and everybody's having to explain why. Sometimes people say, well, they went to the wrong tomb. Again, the disciples tell us the women saw the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus knew where the tomb was. So did the enemies. So did Pilate. It just bears no weight. And then sometimes people come along and tell us, Well, everybody hallucinated that saw him. I want you to listen to this list. Mary Magdalene, Mark 16:9. The 3 women that went to the tomb, Matthew 28, verse 9. The 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, Luke 24:13. Peter, Luke 24:34. The apostles and Thomas, John 20:19 through 29. The 7 disciples by Galilee, John 21. Listen to this one. Over 500 brethren at once, Paul said. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 6. James, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 7. The apostles at his ascension, Acts 1. And finally, Paul born out of due season. The sheer number of appearances is staggering. Lee Strobel, who was not a believer and as we talked about earlier in the lesson, wanted to disprove Christianity to his wife and to others and to himself most of all, said, I have sat in many courtrooms. I can't imagine interviewing 500 witnesses. He said, if we started on Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning and went all day long and broke for the evening, came back in the morning, and we only allowed 15 minutes per interview. That is cross-examination by the other side and the testimony from the first side. And we go all through the week. By Friday, there is 129 hours of testimony. If you've ever sat in a jury and you heard that many people that cannot be refuted testify, what would be your conclusion? They didn't hallucinate. They touched him, they saw him, they heard him. The final evidence. The disciples died for their belief. I realize those guys that flew into the Twin Towers on 9/11 believed in Islam. They believed that they would have their life afterward. But the difference between them and these apostles are they never saw. They're just like you and me in Christianity. We believe, but we believe on the basis of eyewitness testimony. The difference between them and the apostles is the apostles are eyewitnesses. They saw him and touched him and heard him. Those guys that flew into the Twin Towers only believed. And there's a great difference. The disciples died for the belief. You don't die for something that you know is a lie. You die if you make a lot of gold from it. You die if you get a lot of power. You'll risk death, that's what I'm saying. But you don't die for what you know is an absolute lie unless you're crazy. And you would have to claim that all of those guys and others were insane. Paul's conversion. How do you deal with that? Paul, the arch enemy. Why is it thought incredible, he said in Acts 26, verse 8, that any of you that God raises the dead? I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison and receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them, even to foreign cities. How do you explain the turn of the Apostle Paul? Unless it is so. And then the absolute change in Jewish believers. What event could compel thousands upon thousands of practicing Jews to cease offering sacrifices at the temple? To cease the Sabbath, from the standpoint of honoring it as the holy day, and change to worshiping on the first day of the week. To be baptized in water. That's what Gentiles did if they wanted to become a proselyte. But to be baptized in water that you indeed are a sinner that needs the blood of the great sacrifice of Jesus. And then to weekly observe the Lord's Supper. And there are so many secondary readings that you have, great books that are put out by Everett Ferguson, for instance, where he describes what was written after the Bible. that men and women assembled on the first day of the week to partake the Lord's Supper, to worship in the same way that we do. And it's quote after quote after quote in the 2nd century. Sometimes right at the time that John died in the end of the 90s. What explains that? Marvels. And then the two choices that are left to us. If Jesus in fact arose from the dead, then he is the Son of God. And if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then he is a liar and a fraud. John Adams, our second president, was a great man. David McCullough writes a great book about him. But he was a guy that said about himself, he said, they'll never make a monument to me. I've kind of always liked him because I think he's too prickly and he's too stubborn and he's too much like what I see in the mirror. And they'll never make a monument of me either. They're not going to make a monument of John Adams, and he knew that. But he was one of the greatest founders, and that comes out in that story. His belief in what was right and in the judicial system of that time was that what was called the Boston Massacre, John Adams took the case of the British soldiers. Mind you, he would become a great patriot, and he would become a great founder of our country. But at that point, he realized that the truth was on the side of these men who had fired into that crowd. But they fired into the crowd because their life was threatened. They believed their life was threatened. And a man's castle, a soldier's castle is where he was standing. He has a right to defend it. And before New England men, John Adams risked, how do you think his law practice went after that? Pretty badly. But John Adams said in the middle of that trial, facts are stubborn things. Whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or our dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. He believed the truth drawn from that evidence, and he defended those men. And folks, New England men acquitted them. They went free because he had proved his case. Listen to the evidence. Listen to the eyewitnesses. And believe the truth that Jesus arose from the dead on the third day, and he is Lord and Savior and blessed forever. If you're subject to heaven's invitation, if we can bless you this morning by helping you to be baptized into Jesus Christ, come as we stand and sing.